In the quiet suburb of Maple Ridge, where tree-lined streets meet family homes with well-kept lawns, 10-year-old Sophie Wilson once played without a care in the world. Her laughter used to echo through the neighborhood as she raced her bike down gentle slopes, her golden ponytail streaming behind her like a banner of childhood joy. But life has a way of changing when you least expect it. 6 months ago, Sophie's mother noticed unusual bruises on her daughter's arms and legs, bruises that appeared without cause and didn't fade away. Then came the persistent fatigue, the unexplained fevers that kept returning like unwelcome guests, and finally, the nosebleeds that wouldn't stop. What began as routine doctor's visits quickly escalated into specialist appointments, blood tests, and finally, those 3 words that no parent ever wants to hear: acute lymphoblastic leukemia. Sophie's world transformed overnight. Her bedroom, once filled with stuffed animals and art projects, now resembled a satellite medical unit with pill organizers, medical pamphlets, and a calendar marked with treatment dates instead of play dates. The little girl who once couldn't sit still now spent hours curled up beneath her favorite blanket, her body battling an enemy too small to see, but powerful enough to steal her childhood. But even as cancer waged war on her small body, something remarkable happened. Sophie Wilson refused to surrender her spirit. When her hair began falling out in clumps, she didn't hide away. Instead, she asked her father to shave her head completely, declaring with unexpected wisdom that it's just hair and it'll grow back when I'm better. The day after her first chemotherapy session, despite the nausea and fatigue that racked her body, she insisted on completing her science homework because, as she firmly told her worried parents, cancer doesn't mean I get to stop learning. While Sophie fought her internal battle with remarkable courage, her parents, Mark and Diana Wilson, faced a different kind of struggle, one that came in the form of mounting medical bills. The Wilsons were hardworking people who had always managed to provide for their daughter. Mark worked as a high school history teacher, and Diana ran a small florist shop in town. They had health insurance, but it covered only a portion of Sophie's treatments. The specialized medications, the consultations with oncologists, the hospital stays, they all added up to a staggering amount that grew with each passing day. At night, after Sophie had fallen asleep, Mark and Diana would sit at their kitchen table, surrounded by medical bills marked with red, past due stamps, calculator in hand, trying to figure out how to make impossible numbers work. They had already refinanced their modest home, maxed out their credit cards, and Diana had reduced her shop's hours to spend more time with Sophie, further straining their finances. "We'll find a way," Mark would say, his voice firm even as worry lines deepened around his eyes. "We always do." But as the weeks passed, finding a way became increasingly difficult. They cut every possible expense: cable TV, eating out, new clothes. Yet the medical bills continued to outpace their ability to pay. The financial stress began to show in small ways, Diana's hands shaking as she arranged flowers for customers, Mark staying up late grading papers to avoid thinking about their situation, both parents losing weight as they skipped meals to ensure Sophie had everything she needed. What they didn't know was that Sophie noticed everything. From her bedroom, she could hear their hushed, worried conversations. She saw the pile of envelopes her father would quickly hide whenever she entered the room. She noticed how her mother would check price tags on everything, even basic groceries, before making a purchase. At 10 years old, Sophie understood more than her parents realized. One evening, as Sophie lay in her hospital bed during a 3-day treatment stay, she watched her father step into the hallway to take a phone call. Through the partially open door, she could see his shoulders slump as he listened to whoever was on the other end. When he returned, his attempt at a reassuring smile didn't reach his eyes. "Was that the hospital billing department again?" Sophie asked quietly. Mark's surprise was evident. "You don't need to worry about that, sweetheart. That's grown-up stuff." "But I'm the reason for all the bills," Sophie replied, her voice small but clear. Mark sat beside her bed and took her hand, his voice breaking slightly as he spoke. "Listen to me, Sophie Wilson. None of this is your fault, not one bit. Your job is to get better. That's all Mom and I want. We'll figure out the rest." That night, as her parents thought she was sleeping, Sophie made a decision. She might be sick, but she wasn't helpless. If her parents were struggling because of her medical bills, then she would find a way to help. the determination that had always defined her character, the same stubborn will that her teachers noted in parent-teacher conferences, the persistence that helped her master riding a bike without training wheels before any of her friends, now found a new purpose. The idea came to her the next morning as she watched a commercial about summer activities. A group of children were running a lemonade stand, their faces bright with excitement as they handed out cups to smiling adults. Sophie remembered how she and her best friend Maya had run a lemonade stand 2 summers ago, earning almost $40 in a single afternoon. It had seemed like a fortune then. As the medication dripped slowly into her veins, Sophie began to calculate in her head. If she could make $40 in one afternoon, how much could she make if she ran the stand every day? What if she charged a little more than the usual 50 cents, explaining to customers that the money was for her treatment? What if she added cookies or brownies that her mom could help her bake? For the first time in weeks, excitement bubbled up inside Sophie. This wasn't just about making money. It was about taking back control, about contributing, about transforming from a passive patient to an active participant in her own recovery. By the time her mother arrived that afternoon, Sophie had already named her venture, Sophie's Hope Lemonade. Because more than anything, hope was what Sophie wanted to sell. Hope for her recovery, hope for her family's financial relief, and hope that even in the darkest circumstances, there was always something you could do to make things better. What no one could have predicted was how this simple childhood enterprise would soon capture the attention of an unexpected visitor, someone whose presence at a humble lemonade stand would change everything for the Wilson family. As Sophie drifted off to sleep that night in her hospital room, the soft beeping of medical machines creating a strange lullaby, she held on to her new plan like a lifeline. Outside her window, stars twinkled in the night sky, bearing silent witness to the extraordinary courage of an ordinary little girl who refused to let cancer define her story. In her dreams, Sophie saw herself standing behind a lemonade stand, strong and healthy, her hair grown back, smiling as she handed out cups of yellow sunshine to a line of customers that stretched around the block. Little did she know just how prophetic that dream would prove to be, or how one particular customer would transform her simple act of childhood entrepreneurship into something that would capture hearts across the nation. The day after Sophie returned home from her latest hospital stay, she gathered her strength and approached her parents at the breakfast table. Mark was reviewing lesson plans for his substitute teacher, while Diana sorted through a stack of medical insurance papers. Both looked up, surprised to see Sophie dressed in her favorite yellow t-shirt and jeans instead of her usual pajamas. "I want to start a lemonade stand," Sophie announced, her voice stronger than it had been in weeks, "to help pay for my treatments." Mark and Diana exchanged a concerned glance. "Honey," Diana began gently, "that's very thoughtful, but you need to focus on getting better. Your treatments are our responsibility." Sophie shook her head firmly. "I heard you talking about the bills. I want to help. Besides," she added with a small smile, "the doctors said that having a project might be good for me, something to think about besides being sick all the time." Mark pushed aside his papers and studied his daughter's determined face. He recognized the look in her eyes, the same stubborn determination she'd inherited from him. "What exactly are you thinking, Soph?" Sophie pulled out a carefully folded piece of hospital notepaper covered with her neat handwriting. "I've made a plan. We'll call it Sophie's Hope Lemonade. We'll set up on Saturday mornings when more people are out. I'll charge $2 per cup because it's for medical bills, not just regular lemonade. And we'll have a donation jar too for people who want to give more." Diana couldn't help but smile at her daughter's meticulous planning. $2 is a lot for lemonade, sweetheart." "But it's not just lemonade," Sophie explained earnestly. "It's hope. Hope that kids like me can get better." She paused, then added quietly, "I need to do this, Mom. I need to feel like I'm doing something besides just being sick." The conviction in Sophie's voice silenced any further objections. How could they deny their daughter this small sense of control when cancer had taken so much from her already? That evening, Mark made a trip to the hardware store and returned with supplies to build a proper lemonade stand. As he worked in the garage, cutting and measuring wood for a sturdy table with a colorful awning, Diana noticed something she hadn't seen in months: her husband whistling softly as he worked. The next day, Sophie called her best friend, Maya Chen. Despite the challenges of Sophie's illness, Maya had remained a constant in her life, visiting whenever Sophie felt strong enough, bringing homework assignments, and never treating her differently because of her diagnosis. The girls had been inseparable since kindergarten, and if anyone would help with Sophie's new venture, it would be Maya. "I need your artistic skills," Sophie explained when Maya arrived that afternoon, her backpack filled with art supplies. "We need signs and decorations for Sophie's Hope Lemonade." The girls spread butcher paper across the living room floor, surrounded by markers, glitter, and paint. Maya, with her natural artistic talent, sketched a beautiful logo featuring a lemon transformed into a sun, its rays spreading across the paper like beams of light. Beneath it, in bold, hopeful letters, she wrote, "Sophie's Hope Lemonade, turning lemons into healing." "It's perfect," Sophie whispered, her eyes shining with tears and determination. As Maya worked on decorating the stand itself with cheerful yellow and white stripes, Sophie focused on creating informational pamphlets about childhood leukemia. "People should know what they're helping fight," she explained. She carefully researched statistics and treatment options, translating complex medical terminology into simple language that anyone could understand. For the first time since her diagnosis, Sophie felt energized. Her parents noticed the change immediately, how she ate more at dinner, how her laugh, a sound they had feared might be lost forever, occasionally rang through the house again. The lemonade stand wasn't just a fundraising project, it was becoming a symbol of Sophie's refusal to surrender to her illness. When Maya's mother, Lynn, heard about the project, she offered to bake cookies to sell alongside the lemonade. As a professional baker who owned a small patisserie downtown, Lynn's contribution would certainly boost their sales. Soon, other neighbors began reaching out, asking how they could help. Mrs. Jenkins from across the street donated a large cooler to keep the lemonade cold. Mr. Peterson, who ran the local printing shop, offered to professionally print Sophie's informational pamphlets free of charge. The night before their grand opening, Sophie stood in the garage admiring the finished stand. Her father had done an amazing job, creating a professional-looking kiosk painted in cheerful yellow with Sophie's Hope emblazoned across the top in Maya's beautiful lettering. Small fairy lights were strung along the awning, giving it a magical quality even in the dim garage light. "What do you think?" Mark asked, his arm around Sophie's thin shoulders. "It's better than I imagined," Sophie replied, leaning against her father. "Do you think people will come?" "I think they will," Mark assured her, though privately he worried about his daughter's expectations. What if only a few neighbors stopped by? What if Sophie, who tired so easily these days, couldn't handle even a few hours outside? What if she faced rejection or indifference from passers-by? That night, as Sophie slept, excited about the next day's grand opening, Mark and Diana sat on their back porch swing, voices low. "I'm worried she's setting herself up for disappointment," Diana confessed. "You know how Sophie is. She's calculated that she'll make enough to cover next month's medication copay." Mark nodded, his concerns mirroring his wife's. "But we have to let her try, even if we end up being the ones buying most of the lemonade." Diana smiled sadly, leaning her head against her husband's shoulder. "When did our 10-year-old become so grown up?" "The day she decided cancer wouldn't define her," Mark replied, his voice rough with emotion. Neither of them could have predicted how their daughter's simple lemonade stand would soon capture the attention of their community and beyond. Neither could have imagined that a famous face would soon appear among their customers, or that Sophie's brave initiative would spark a chain of events that would change everything. As the Wilson household finally fell silent that night, the lemonade stand waited in the garage, a beacon of hope constructed from wood, paint, and the indomitable spirit of a child who refused to be defined by her diagnosis. Tomorrow would bring challenges: weather, Sophie's unpredictable energy levels, the uncertainty of public response, but it would also bring possibility. And for the Wilson family, possibility was something worth holding on to. Saturday morning arrived with unexpected challenges. Sophie woke early, buzzing with nervous energy, despite having undergone a chemotherapy session just 3 days prior. She stood at her bedroom window, her heart sinking, as she noticed dark clouds gathering on the horizon. The weather forecast had promised sunshine, but Mother Nature apparently had other plans. "Maybe we should postpone," Diana suggested gently, as she helped Sophie into a warm sweater. noticing how her daughter's hands trembled slightly with fatigue. "We could try again next weekend when you're feeling stronger." Sophie shook her head firmly. "No postponing," she insisted. "The bills don't postpone, so neither can we." Mark and Diana exchanged a concerned glance over their daughter's head, but they recognized the determined set of her jaw. Together, they loaded the lemonade stand into Mark's pickup truck and drove to their chosen location, the corner of Maple Ridge Park, where weekend joggers, dog walkers, and families with children regularly passed by. Setting up proved more challenging than anticipated. The spring wind gusted unpredictably, threatening to topple their carefully painted signs. Mark had to drive home for additional weights to secure everything. Meanwhile, Sophie and Maya worked diligently, arranging cookies on trays and filling the cooler with freshly squeezed lemonade that Diana had helped prepare that morning. By 9:30, everything was finally ready. Sophie sat on a folding chair behind the stand, wearing her yellow Sophie's Hope t-shirt that Maya had designed, a bright blue beanie covering her bare head. Maya stood beside her, waving enthusiastically at passing cars, but few slowed down. The park, usually bustling on Saturday mornings, was surprisingly empty, likely due to the threatening weather. "It's okay," Sophie reassured her parents, who hovered nearby with worried expressions. "It's still early." The first hour passed slowly. 3 joggers stopped for lemonade, expressing admiration for Sophie's initiative, but hurrying away as the first raindrops began to fall. A family with young children purchased cookies and lemonade, the mother slipping an extra $20 into the donation jar while her children were distracted. An elderly gentleman walking his dog stayed longer, reading Sophie's informational pamphlet about childhood leukemia with genuine interest before buying lemonade he didn't drink and cookies he gave to his dog. By 11 o'clock, the temperature had dropped significantly. The spring day that should have been mild and sunny had transformed into a blustery, cold affair, more reminiscent of winter than late spring. Sophie's hands, already susceptible to cold due to her treatment, had turned worryingly pale. Diana wrapped a blanket around her daughter's shoulders, her concern growing as she noticed the fatigue shadowing Sophie's eyes. "Just a little longer," Sophie pleaded when Mark suggested packing up. "Please, Dad." Mark couldn't refuse her, not when she looked at him with such determination. Instead, he jogged to the car and returned with a portable space heater they used for camping, setting it up beneath the stand to provide some warmth. Maya, ever loyal, maintained her enthusiasm, waving at cars and calling out to pedestrians who hurried past with collars turned up against the increasingly hostile weather. "Fresh lemonade for a great cause," she shouted, her voice growing hoarse from the effort. By noon, they had made just under $40, far from the hundreds Sophie had optimistically calculated. The temperature continued to drop, and now small pellets of hail occasionally mixed with the rain. The colorful awning that had seemed so cheerful in their garage now drooped sadly, collecting pools of rainwater that threatened to collapse the entire structure. Diana could see the disappointment in Sophie's eyes, though her daughter tried valiantly to hide it. "We can try again when the weather's better," Diana suggested gently. "This is just our first attempt." Sophie nodded silently, her earlier enthusiasm visibly dimmed. As they began packing up, a middle-aged couple hurried over from their car parked across the street. "Are you the lemonade girl we heard about?" the woman asked breathlessly. "Our neighbor mentioned you'd be here today." Sophie straightened in her chair, summoning a smile. "Yes, that's me. Would you like some lemonade? It's for my medical treatments." The couple bought 4 cups of lemonade and a dozen cookies, insisting they needed them for a meeting later that day. As they paid, the man leaned down to Sophie's level. "My sister had leukemia when she was about your age," he said quietly. "She's 43 now, with 3 kids of her own. Keep fighting, young lady." For the first time that day, genuine hope flickered in Sophie's eyes. "Thank you for telling me that," she whispered. As they finally loaded the last of their supplies into Mark's truck, Sophie's energy reserves were clearly depleted. Her face had taken on the gray pallor that her parents had learned to recognize as a warning sign. Mark lifted her into the truck cab, alarmed at how light she felt in his arms. "I'm sorry it wasn't more successful," Sophie murmured as they drove home, her eyelids heavy with exhaustion. "Are you kidding?" Maya countered fiercely. "We made almost $70 on a horrible weather day. That's amazing. Indeed, between sales and donations, they had collected $68.42, nowhere near enough for medical bills, but a testament to the few kind souls who had braved the elements to support a sick child's initiative. At home, Sophie went straight to bed, her body demanding rest after the morning's exertions. Diana tucked her in, noticing with concern the dark circles beneath her daughter's eyes. "I'm proud of you," Diana whispered, smoothing Sophie's beanie. "So proud." "We're trying again next weekend," Sophie murmured sleepily, "but maybe we should check the weather forecast more carefully." Diana smiled, kissing her daughter's forehead. "Rest now. We can plan version 2.0 tomorrow." Downstairs, Mark counted the day's modest earnings, separating the bills and coins into neat piles on the kitchen table. Maya helped Diana clean and store the leftover cookies, her usual chatter subdued. "Don't worry," Diana told them both. "This was just day one. Things will get better." None of them could have known how prophetic those words would prove to be, or that Sophie's lemonade stand would soon catch the attention of someone who would transform their modest fundraising effort into something beyond their wildest dreams. For now, though, as rain continued to lash against the windows and Sophie slept upstairs, recovering her strength, the Wilson family could only hope that next weekend would bring better weather and more customers to Sophie's Hope lemonade stand. The following Monday, as Sophie rested at home recovering from the weekend's exertions, something unexpected happened at Maple Ridge Elementary School. Her teacher, Ms. Roberts, mentioned Sophie's lemonade stand during morning announcements, encouraging students to visit the stand the following weekend. By lunchtime, students were making handmade posters to hang around the neighborhood, transforming Sophie's small initiative into a school project. Meanwhile, across town, Jessica Lynn, a reporter for the Maple Ridge Gazette, was desperately searching for a human interest story for Wednesday's edition. When her colleague mentioned overhearing a conversation about a child with cancer running a lemonade stand to pay for her own treatment, Jessica immediately recognized the potential. A few phone calls led her to Sophie's school and eventually to the Wilson home. "We're not looking for publicity," Diana explained hesitantly when Jessica called. "Sophie just wanted to do something positive during a difficult time." "That's exactly why people need to hear her story," Jessica replied. "In a world full of negative news, your daughter's courage could inspire others." After consulting with Sophie, who was immediately enthusiastic about the possibility of attracting more customers, the Wilsons agreed to a small interview and photo session the next day. Jessica arrived punctually, a photographer in tow. She had expected to find a household shrouded in sorrow, but instead discovered a home filled with quiet determination. Sophie, despite her obvious fatigue, spoke articulately about her diagnosis, her treatment, and her decision to start the lemonade stand. "I didn't want to just be the sick kid," Sophie explained, sitting cross-legged on the couch in her living room. "I wanted to do something to help my parents, because they're doing everything to help me." The story ran in Wednesday's edition, featuring a photograph of Sophie beside her lemonade stand, her bright smile defying the gravity of her situation. The headline read, "Local girl fights cancer, 1 cup of lemonade at a time." In the article, Jessica included details about Sophie's upcoming lemonade stand dates and a quote from Dr. Rivera, Sophie's oncologist, about the importance of positive attitudes in cancer treatment. What happened next surprised everyone. By Wednesday afternoon, the Wilsons' phone was ringing constantly. Local businesses called offering donations. The owner of Hargrove's Grocery pledged to provide free lemons for as long as Sophie's stand remained open. The mayor's office reached out to grant special permission for the stand to operate in the busier town square rather than at the edge of the park. A local radio station asked to do a live broadcast from the stand on Saturday morning. More surprising was the response on social media. Someone had shared the Gazette article online, and within hours, Sophie's Hope Lemonade had its own hashtag. A local high school student created a social media page for the stand, which gained over 1,000 followers by Thursday evening. Complete strangers shared Sophie's story, pledging to visit her stand. "This is getting bigger than we anticipated," Mark told Diana on Thursday night after Sophie had gone to bed. "Are we sure this is good for her? She's still in active treatment." Diana shared his concerns, but she had also seen the transformation in their daughter over the past few days. Sophie's energy had returned, not just physically, but emotionally. She spent hours responding to supportive messages online, creating new signs for the stand, and planning improvements based on their first day's experience. "I think we need to let this play out," Diana replied carefully. For the first time since her diagnosis, she's excited about something. That has to count for something in her healing process. By Friday afternoon, Sophie's story had reached beyond Maple Ridge. A regional news network picked up the article, interviewing Jessica Lynn about her reporting. The reporter emphasized the financial struggles the Wilson family faced, explaining how, even with insurance, the out-of-pocket expenses for Sophie's treatment were devastating their finances. "This is a hard-working American family," Jessica explained on camera. "They're not asking for handouts. In fact, it's their 10-year-old daughter who refused to be a passive victim and decided to take action herself." Saturday morning dawned bright and clear, a perfect spring day, as if the weather itself had joined the community effort. When the Wilsons arrived at the town square to set up, they were astonished to find a crowd already waiting. The mayor was there, along with several town council members. The high school marching band had arranged to play nearby, attracting additional attention. Sophie, wearing her yellow Sophie's Hope t-shirt and a new blue bandana Maya had given her to cover her head, couldn't stop smiling despite having undergone a chemotherapy session just 2 days prior. The energy of the crowd seemed to infuse her with strength. "Remember, you can take breaks whenever you need to," Diana reminded her daughter, setting up a comfortable chair behind the stand. But Sophie was too excited to sit. As customers lined up, not just a few neighbors, but dozens of people, she greeted each one personally, thanking them for coming and explaining about childhood leukemia to anyone who asked. Maya worked alongside her, pouring lemonade as fast as Sophie could accept payments. By mid-morning, the line stretched around the square. Local restaurants, seeing the crowd, set up impromptu food stalls nearby, pledging a percentage of their sales to Sophie's cause. A face-painting booth appeared, operated by high school art students, with all proceeds going directly to the Wilsons' medical fund. When Jessica Lynn arrived with her camera crew, she found not just a lemonade stand, but a full-fledged community festival. "This is unprecedented," she told her cameraman. "I've covered a lot of community events, but I've never seen anything come together this quickly." As noon approached, Mark had to make an emergency trip to the grocery store for more supplies. They had sold over 200 cups of lemonade in just 3 hours, 10 times what they had prepared for. The donation jar overflowed so frequently that the local bank manager, who happened to be in attendance, offered to count and secure the money periodically throughout the day. "Your daughter has united the entire town," the bank manager told Mark as they watched Sophie chatting animatedly with customers. "In 20 years of living here, I've never seen Maple Ridge come together like this." Mark nodded, emotion making it difficult to speak. Across the square, he could see Diana talking with a group of mothers, some of whom had children undergoing cancer treatment at the same hospital as Sophie. Connections were being formed, support networks established, all because his brave little girl had refused to surrender to circumstances. By day's end, Sophie's Hope Lemonade had raised over $3,700, an amount that would cover Sophie's medication copays for several months. But more valuable than the money was the sense of community that had formed around their family, lifting them from isolation into a network of support. As they packed up the stand, exhausted but exhilarated, none of them could have predicted that the weekend's events were just the beginning, or that Sophie's next customer would change everything. The success of Saturday's event energized Sophie beyond what any medicine had accomplished in months. Despite her doctor's warnings about overexertion, she insisted on opening the lemonade stand again on Sunday, though her parents negotiated a shorter time frame, just 2 hours in the afternoon, after she'd had a morning to rest. "If people are willing to help, I need to be there," Sophie insisted at breakfast, her voice stronger than it had been in weeks. It wouldn't be right to just take donations without thanking people personally. By noon, Sophie was back at her stand in the town square, though the crowd had thinned considerably from the previous day. Still, a steady stream of customers arrived, many bringing additional donations from friends or family members who couldn't attend. The local news station sent a reporter for a brief follow-up segment, capturing footage of community members gathered around Sophie's stand. At around 1:30, as the afternoon heat intensified and Sophie began showing signs of fatigue, Diana suggested they begin packing up. "You've done more than enough this weekend, sweetheart," she said, noting the shadows beneath her daughter's eyes. "Let's head home so you can rest before dinner." Sophie nodded reluctantly, handing a cup of lemonade to what she assumed would be her final customer of the day, an elderly woman who insisted on paying $20 for her single cup. As Diana began collecting the unsold cookies and Maya wiped down the countertop, a silver SUV with tinted windows pulled up nearby. No one paid much attention when a man stepped out of the vehicle. Wearing jeans, a gray baseball cap pulled low, and sunglasses, he blended easily with the Sunday crowd. He stood at the edge of the square for a moment, hands in the pockets of his leather jacket, observing the scene before him. Then, with a nod to the driver who remained in the SUV, he walked toward Sophie's lemonade stand. "Are you still open?" he asked, his voice low and pleasant. Sophie, who had been about to collapse her chair, immediately straightened. "Yes, sir. We're always open for one more customer." The man smiled, removing his sunglasses and tucking them into his jacket pocket. "I hear you make the best lemonade in town." "It's my grandmother's recipe," Sophie explained earnestly, pouring a fresh cup. "The secret is a tiny bit of vanilla extract and using both regular and Meyer lemons." "Sounds delicious," the man replied, accepting the cup and taking a sip. That is good. Worth the trip, I'd say." Something about his voice tickled at Mark's memory. He glanced up from the cooler he was emptying and felt a shock of recognition. Though the cap shadowed his features, there was no mistaking those eyes or that distinctive scar on his chin. The customer standing before Sophie's lemonade stand was Harrison Ford. Mark froze, unsure whether to acknowledge the actor's identity or respect his obvious attempt at privacy. His momentary dilemma was solved when Maya, returning from throwing away trash, stopped dead in her tracks, eyes widening to impossible proportions. You're Han Solo," she blurted, then immediately clapped her hands over her mouth, looking mortified. The man chuckled, his famous crooked smile appearing. "Sometimes," he acknowledged wryly, "but today I'm just a guy who heard about some excellent lemonade for a good cause." Sophie, who had been focused on carefully securing the lid on his cup, finally looked up properly at her customer. Unlike Maya, she didn't immediately recognize him. At 10 years old, Sophie was more familiar with animated films than with Star Wars or Indiana Jones. "Are you someone famous?" she asked innocently, her bald head tilting with curiosity beneath her blue bandana. Ford's laugh was genuine, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "In some circles," he replied modestly, "but right now, I'm more interested in hearing about you and this impressive operation you've got here." By now, Diana had noticed the famous customer as well, but taking her cue from the actor's casual demeanor, she simply smiled and continued packing, allowing Sophie her moment. "I'm raising money for my medical treatments," Sophie explained, her voice matter-of-fact rather than pitying. "I have acute lymphoblastic leukemia, and even with insurance, the bills are really high. My parents were worried about money, so I decided to help." Ford's expression sobered as he listened to Sophie. "That's a heavy load for someone your age to carry," he observed gently. Sophie shrugged, a gesture that somehow conveyed both childlike innocence and ancient wisdom. "Cancer is a heavy load for anyone, but my doctor says attitude matters, so I try to focus on what I can do instead of what I can't." Something in her words seemed to resonate deeply with the actor. He took another sip of lemonade, his gaze never leaving Sophie's face. "How long have you been dealing with this?" 6 months, 2 weeks, and 4 days, Sophie answered promptly. "But who's counting?" The small joke, delivered with perfect timing, surprised a laugh out of Ford. "You've got spirit, kid. I like that." The Star Wars reference was unintentional, but it made Maya, still hovering nearby in starstruck silence, gasp audibly. "How much do I owe you for this excellent lemonade?" Ford asked, reaching for his wallet. $2, Sophie replied. "But we also have a donation jar if you want to contribute more to children's cancer research. That's different from my treatment fund. My parents and I decided that half of all donations should go to research so other kids might not have to go through this in the future." Ford looked at the colorfully decorated jar labeled "For the Future" that sat beside Sophie's cash box. Something in his expression shifted, a deepening respect, perhaps, for this child who thought of others even while fighting her own battle. "I think I can do a bit better than that," he said quietly. What happened next would later be described by witnesses as surreal and like something from a movie, but better because it was real. Harrison Ford, known for his intensely private nature and reluctance to leverage his celebrity, spent the next 15 minutes talking with Sophie about her treatments, her hopes, and her surprisingly nuanced understanding of both cancer research and the healthcare system. Their conversation drew a small crowd, though most people maintained a respectful distance, many surreptitiously recording on their phones. Ford either didn't notice or chose to ignore the attention, keeping his focus entirely on the bald little girl in the yellow t-shirt who spoke about cellular biology with the same enthusiasm other children reserved for candy or toys. "You know," Ford finally said, "I think this lemonade stand of yours deserves a proper tip." He pulled out his checkbook, an old-fashioned gesture in the age of digital payments, and began writing. Sophie watched curiously, unaware of the significance of the moment unfolding before her. When Ford handed her the check, she looked down and blinked repeatedly, as if her eyes must be deceiving her. "Sir," she said, her voice suddenly small, "I think you made a mistake. This says $100,000. The actor shook his head, that famous half-smile appearing again. "No mistake, Sophie. Consider it an investment in both your future and the research you care about." The square fell silent as the magnitude of the moment registered with onlookers. Diana's hands flew to her mouth, tears immediately springing to her eyes. Mark stood frozen, the empty cooler forgotten in his hands. Maya, overcome, simply sat down on the grass where she had been standing. Sophie looked up from the check, her expression serious. "Thank you, Mr. Ford. I promise I'll use it wisely." "I know you will," he replied, reaching out to shake her hand formally, treating her not as a child or a charity case, but as a person of substance and dignity. "Keep fighting the good fight, Sophie Wilson. The world needs more people like you." For several long moments after Harrison Ford handed Sophie the check, time seemed suspended in the town square. Sophie stood perfectly still, the paper trembling slightly in her small hand. Diana remained frozen, tears streaming silently down her face. Mark seemed unable to process what had just happened, blinking rapidly as if to clear his vision. It was Sophie who finally broke the spell. Looking up from the check to Harrison Ford's face, she asked with remarkable composure, "Why? You don't even know me." The actor's expression softened, the lines around his eyes deepening with sincerity. "Sometimes you just know when something's right," he replied, his voice carrying in the hushed square. "I've been fortunate in my life, very fortunate. And with that comes a responsibility to pay it forward when you see someone fighting with such courage." He glanced around, seeming to notice for the first time the growing crowd of onlookers, many with phones raised to capture the moment. A flicker of his characteristic wariness crossed his face, but then he appeared to make a decision. Rather than retreating, he placed a gentle hand on Sophie's shoulder. "May I say something to everyone?" he asked her quietly. Sophie nodded, still clutching the check as if it might dissolve if she loosened her grip. Ford turned to face the gathered crowd, his presence commanding immediate attention without any need to raise his voice. "I didn't come here for publicity," he began, his tone direct yet warm. "I came because I read about a brave young girl who refused to be defined by her diagnosis. But now that I'm here, I want to challenge everyone watching or hearing about this to match my commitment in whatever way you can." The crowd murmured, phones still recording. "It doesn't have to be financial," Ford continued. "Give blood, register as a bone marrow donor, support research, call your representatives about healthcare costs. These kids fighting cancer, they shouldn't have to sell lemonade to pay for the treatments that saved their lives." His words hung in the air, carrying both compassion and a gentle rebuke to a system that placed such burdens on families already fighting for their children's lives. Mark found his voice at last, stepping forward to stand beside his daughter. "Mr. Ford," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I don't know how to thank you." The actor shook his head. "No thanks needed. Just promise me you'll let Sophie focus on getting better instead of worrying about bills." "I promise," Mark replied, extending his hand. As the two men shook hands, A spontaneous applause broke out among the onlookers. The modest lemonade stand in a small-town square had become the stage for an extraordinary moment of human connection that transcended celebrity and circumstance. Maya, finally recovering from her shock, hurried to Sophie's side. "That's Harrison Ford," she whispered urgently in her friend's ear. "Han Solo and Indiana Jones, the most famous actor ever." Sophie's eyes widened as the significance finally registered. "Oh, I've seen your movies at my cousin's house," she exclaimed, looking up at Ford with new understanding. "You're the archaeologist who fights Nazis." Ford laughed, a genuine sound that crinkled his entire face. "That's one way to put it." The crowd, which had maintained a respectful distance, now began to press closer, emboldened by the actor's openness. Sensing the shift, the driver of the SUV approached, his posture suggesting he served as Ford's security. "We should probably move along, sir," he suggested quietly. Ford nodded but turned back to Sophie. "Before I go, that research fund you mentioned, is there a specific organization you support?" Sophie didn't hesitate. "The Children's Leukemia Research Foundation. My doctor works with them on clinical trials. They're trying to make treatments that don't make kids as sick as the current ones do." "Good choice," Ford approved. "I'll have my foundation contact them directly." As he prepared to leave, Diana finally found her voice. "Mr. Ford," she called, stepping forward with tears still glistening on her cheeks. "You've given us more than money today. You've given Sophie something to fight for, a chance to complete her treatment without the shadow of financial ruin hanging over our family. I don't know how we'll ever repay that gift." Ford's expression was gentle but firm. "There's nothing to repay, Mrs. Wilson. Just channel that energy into supporting your remarkable daughter." He turned to Sophie once more. "Keep making that excellent lemonade, kid. The world needs your brand of hope." With that, he replaced his sunglasses, nodded to the still applauding crowd, and walked back to his waiting vehicle. As the SUV pulled away, the square erupted in excited conversation, people turning to each other to confirm what they had just witnessed. Local news reporters who had lingered from earlier coverage rushed toward the Wilson family, microphones extended. Jessica Lynn from the Gazette reached them first. "Sophie, how does it feel to receive such an incredible donation?" she asked, her professional demeanor barely containing her own excitement. Sophie looked down at the check in her hand, then up at the reporter. "It feels like hope," she said simply, "not just for me, but for other kids too." As cameras flashed and more questions flew, Mark gently intervened. "I think that's enough for today," he said firmly. "Sophie needs to rest." The mention of Sophie's health sobered the crowd somewhat. People began to disperse, though many approached the stand first to add their own modest contributions to the donation jar, now inspired by Ford's gesture. In the midst of the excitement, Diana noticed Sophie's face had grown pale, her energy finally depleting after the emotional encounter. "Time to go home, sweetheart," she murmured, wrapping a supportive arm around her daughter's thin shoulders. As they packed the last of their supplies, the town's bank manager approached again. "I'd be happy to help you set up a proper fund for that check," he offered, "and to secure today's donations." Mark nodded gratefully. "Tomorrow morning?" "We need to get Sophie home now." "Of course," the banker agreed, helping load the last box into Mark's truck. The drive home was unusually quiet, each family member processing the extraordinary events in their own way. Maya, who had received permission to come home with the Wilsons, finally broke the silence. "Does this mean you can get that new treatment, doctor?" Rivera mentioned, the targeted therapy that's not fully covered by insurance. Sophie looked up from the check she still held carefully in her lap. "Yes," she whispered, "and maybe help some other kids get it too." Diana reached back from the front seat to squeeze her daughter's hand. "You did this, Sophie. Your courage, your determination, that's what Harrison Ford responded to today." "Not just me," Sophie replied thoughtfully. "Everyone who helped. Maya, the neighbors, the people who shared our story online. Mr. Ford just finished what the community started." Mark glanced at his daughter in the rearview mirror, struck by the wisdom in her words. At just 10 years old, fighting a disease that would bring many adults to their knees, Sophie somehow maintained a perspective that transcended her years and circumstances. As they pulled into their driveway, Sophie carefully folded the check and handed it to her father. "Keep this safe, Dad. Tomorrow we need to figure out how to use it the right way." Mark nodded, tucking the check into his wallet with hands that still trembled slightly. "We will, Soph. I promise." That evening, as Sophie rested in her bedroom, exhausted but exhilarated, Mark and Diana sat on their back porch, the weight of financial worry lifted from their shoulders for the first time since Sophie's diagnosis. "What happens now?" Diana wondered aloud, her head resting against her husband's shoulder. Mark gazed at the stars appearing in the twilight sky. "Now," he said softly, "Sophie can focus on what matters most, getting better, and we can focus on helping her do that without counting pennies or worrying about mortgaging our future." Inside the house, unbeknownst to her parents, Sophie sat at her desk, writing in her journal, documenting the day when a famous actor had recognized her fight and responded with extraordinary generosity. But more importantly, she was making plans, not just for her own treatment, but for how she could use this unexpected blessing to help other children facing the same battle she fought every day. By Monday morning, the story of Harrison Ford's extraordinary donation had spread far beyond Maple Ridge. What began as cell phone videos shared on social media soon caught the attention of national news outlets. While the Wilsons slept, exhausted from the weekend's emotional roller coaster, their phones began buzzing with notifications, calls, and messages. Mark awoke to find 17 missed calls on his cell phone and twice as many text messages. Logging onto his email, he discovered his inbox flooded with interview requests from major networks, newspapers, and talk shows. The local story had gone viral overnight, capturing the hearts of people across the country. "Diana," he called, his voice uncertain as he scrolled through the messages. "I think we might need to turn off our phones today." Diana joined him at the kitchen table, her own phone continuously buzzing with alerts. "This is overwhelming," she murmured, watching as yet another call came through, this time from a major morning show in New York. "What should we do?" Before Mark could answer, Sophie appeared in the doorway, rubbing sleep from her eyes. Despite yesterday's excitement, she'd slept better than she had in months, her face showing more color than it had in weeks. "Why is the phone ringing so much?" she asked, settling into her usual breakfast chair. Mark and Diana exchanged a glance, unsure how to explain the sudden media frenzy to their daughter. "Remember those people filming yesterday when Mr. Ford was at your lemonade stand?" Mark began carefully. "Well, they shared those videos, and now a lot of people want to talk to us about what happened." Sophie considered this as she reached for an apple from the fruit bowl. "Is that good or bad?" "It's complicated," Diana answered honestly. "The attention could help raise more awareness for childhood cancer research, which is good, but it also means a lot of people might be focused on us when we're trying to concentrate on your treatment." The family's discussion was interrupted by the doorbell. Mark peered through the front window to find Jessica Lynn, the local reporter who had first covered Sophie's story, standing on their porch alongside a cameraman. "Jessica's here," he told Diana with a sigh. "I think we should talk to her, at least. She was supportive from the beginning, before all this attention." Diana nodded, quickly helping Sophie change from pajamas into day clothes before Mark invited Jessica inside. "I know this is overwhelming," Jessica said immediately, declining the offered coffee and getting straight to the point. "Every news outlet in the country wants this story, and I don't blame them, but I wanted to offer some guidance, having covered human interest stories for years." "We could definitely use some advice," Diana admitted, her hand protectively on Sophie's shoulder. Jessica smiled kindly. "First, you don't owe anyone your story. You can decline all interviews if that feels right for your family. Second, if you do want to speak about what happened, consider choosing just one or two outlets rather than trying to talk to everyone. And third," she added, looking directly at Sophie, "remember that this is ultimately about helping kids with cancer, not about meeting a famous actor." Sophie nodded solemnly. "I want to help other kids, but I don't want to be on TV all the time. I still have to go to my treatments." "That's very wise," Jessica affirmed. "And speaking of treatments, I have some news that might interest you. After yesterday's events, the Children's Leukemia Research Foundation has received over $500,000 in donations from people inspired by your story and Mr. Ford's generosity." Mark's jaw dropped. 500,000? Already? Jessica nodded. The power of social media combined with a beloved celebrity's endorsement is extraordinary. People who watched those videos wanted to help too, even if they couldn't match Mr. Ford's contribution. Diana squeezed Sophie's shoulder, tears welling in her eyes. You see, sweetheart, you've already made a difference for other children fighting this disease. Sophie absorbed this information with the gravity that had become characteristic of her since her diagnosis. Then I think we should do some interviews, she decided. Not all of them, but enough to keep reminding people about helping kids with cancer. Mark and Diana looked at their daughter with a mixture of pride and concern. At just 10 years old, Sophie displayed a sense of purpose and clarity that many adults never achieved. Her illness had forced her to confront realities no child should face, yet somehow she had translated that experience into wisdom rather than bitterness. If you're sure, Mark said cautiously, we could select one national program and maybe continue working with Jessica for local updates, but your health and treatment come first, always. The decision made, Jessica helped the family craft a brief statement for her newspaper, which could also be shared with other media outlets. Together, they emphasized the ongoing needs of families facing childhood cancer and directed interested readers to legitimate research foundations rather than focusing solely on Sophie's personal story. As Jessica prepared to leave, her phone buzzed with a notification. She glanced at the screen and gasped softly. Harrison Ford's publicist just released a statement, she told the Wilsons, quickly scanning the text. He confirms his donation to Sophie's treatment fund and the Children's Leukemia Research Foundation and... She paused, looking up with astonishment. He's calling for healthcare reform to ensure that no family faces financial ruin due to a child's illness. The implications of this statement weren't lost on any of them. A beloved actor with Ford's influence addressing healthcare policy could potentially shift national conversation in meaningful ways. He didn't have to do that, Diana whispered, visibly moved. I have a feeling your daughter made quite an impression on him, Jessica replied, glancing at Sophie with respect. After Jessica left, promising to run interference with other media as much as possible, the Wilsons gathered in their living room to process the whirlwind their lives had become. Outside, they could see several news vans parked along their street, reporters waiting hopefully for a statement or interview. I never expected any of this, Sophie admitted, looking out the window at the gathering media. I just wanted to help with the bills. Mark put his arm around his daughter. Sometimes, small actions lead to big changes, Soph. Your courage created ripples that are still spreading. That afternoon, the Wilson family gave a single interview to a respected national evening news program, conducted in their living room with Sophie's treatment schedule accommodated. Sophie spoke with remarkable poise about her diagnosis, her lemonade stand, and her surprise at Harrison Ford's generosity. But most powerful were her words about other children fighting cancer. I'm getting a lot of attention because something amazing happened to me, she explained to the interviewer. But there are thousands of kids fighting just as hard as I am, whose families are worried about money just like mine was. They deserve help too. The interview aired that evening, further amplifying Sophie's story across the nation. By nightfall, the Children's Leukemia Research Foundation reported an unprecedented surge in donations, with their website temporarily crashing due to traffic volume. Hashtags related to Sophie, Harrison Ford, and childhood cancer research trended across social media platforms. As Sophie prepared for bed that night, exhausted but fulfilled by the day's events, she looked at her mother with serious eyes. Do you think Mr. Ford knows what he started? Diana smiled, smoothing her daughter's favorite blanket. I think he knew exactly what he was doing, sweetheart. He saw your fighting spirit and wanted to make sure the whole world saw it too. Sophie nodded, settling against her pillows. Tomorrow I have chemotherapy, she said matter-of-factly. Will you tell the reporters they have to go away so I can rest afterward? Absolutely, Diana promised, kissing her daughter's forehead. Your health comes first, always. As Sophie drifted off to sleep, her parents stood in the doorway watching her, still processing the extraordinary turn their lives had taken. What had begun as a simple lemonade stand, born of a child's desire to help her family, had transformed into a national conversation about healthcare, community support, and the courage of one small girl facing an enormous challenge. Outside their modest home, the news vans remained, their satellite dishes pointed skyward, broadcasting Sophie's story to a nation suddenly captivated by a child selling lemonade and the movie star who recognized her extraordinary spirit. 3 days after Harrison Ford's unexpected appearance at Sophie's lemonade stand, life began settling into a new rhythm for the Wilson family. The initial media frenzy had subsided somewhat, though Sophie's story continued to circulate online and in newspapers across the country. More importantly, Sophie had to return to the reality of her treatment, the grueling cycle of chemotherapy, medication, and recovery that defined her life as a cancer patient. Wednesday morning found Sophie in the familiar surroundings of the pediatric oncology department at Memorial Children's Hospital, settled into the blue reclining chair where she spent hours every week as medicine dripped slowly into her veins. The sterile smell of disinfectant mingled with the artificial cherry scent used to mask it, a combination Sophie had come to associate with both healing and suffering. "Your counts are looking better this week," Dr. Rivera noted encouragingly as she checked Sophie's latest blood work. "The neutrophils are coming up nicely." Sophie nodded, having learned more about blood cell components in 6 months than most adults learn in a lifetime. "So, my immune system is stronger?" "Exactly," Dr. Rivera confirmed with an approving smile. She had always appreciated Sophie's determination to understand her own treatment, which means we might be able to be a bit more aggressive with this round of chemotherapy. Diana, seated beside her daughter as always during treatments, felt the familiar twist of anxiety these discussions provoked. Aggressive in cancer treatment often meant more severe side effects, more nausea, more fatigue, more days when Sophie couldn't get out of bed. "Will it make me sicker?" Sophie asked directly, sensing her mother's concern. Dr. Rivera's honesty was one reason the Wilsons trusted her so completely. "Probably for a few days," she acknowledged, "but it also gives us a better chance of targeting any remaining cancer cells. Sometimes we have to feel worse to get better." Sophie considered this, then nodded decisively. "Let's do it." As the nurse prepared the adjusted medication, Diana stepped into the hallway to call Mark with the update. The pediatric oncology floor was quieter than usual today, with only 3 other children receiving treatment in the large communal infusion room. Sophie had gotten to know most of the regular patients over the months, recognizing their faces, remembering their names, noting with dread when familiar faces stopped appearing for treatments. Across the room sat 7-year-old Elijah, accompanied by his grandmother. He was newly diagnosed, his face still round from the steroids, his eyes wide, with the fear Sophie remembered all too well from her early days. Beside him, 14-year-old Zoe dozed in her chair, a knit cap covering her bare head, her mother working quietly on a laptop beside her. In the corner, 5-year-old Miguel played with action figures on his lap, his father reading to him softly in Spanish as the chemotherapy drugs entered his tiny body. These were Sophie's true companions in battle, fellow warriors in a fight too few people understood unless they had lived it themselves. They shared knowing glances when newcomers mourned their hair loss, traded tips about which anti-nausea medications worked best, celebrated each other's good scan results, and understood the unspoken fear behind casual questions about someone's absence. As Sophie settled in for the long hours of her infusion, Diana returned with a surprising update. "Mark just texted," she said, her voice pitched low for privacy. "The hospital administration called him. Apparently, there's going to be a special visitor to the pediatric ward today." Sophie raised her eyebrows. "Let me guess, another local celebrity wanting photos with sick kids?" It had happened before, well-meaning visits that nonetheless felt exploitative to many of the patients and families. Diana shook her head. They wouldn't say who, just that security procedures were being implemented for a high-profile visitor. Before they could speculate further, an unusual bustle of activity began at the nurses' station. Several hospital administrators in formal attire appeared, speaking in hushed, excited tones with the regular medical staff. 2 men in suits with discreet earpieces positioned themselves near the department entrance, a clear sign that someone of significance was expected. "Something's definitely happening," Sophie observed, her natural curiosity momentarily distracting her from the uncomfortable pressure of the IV in her arm. Around noon, as Sophie was picking at the lunch tray the hospital provided, the double doors to the oncology ward swung open. The room fell silent as Harrison Ford himself walked in, accompanied by Dr. Patel, the head of pediatric oncology. He wore no disguise today, no baseball cap or sunglasses, just simple slacks and a button-down shirt, his presence immediately commanding attention without any Hollywood fanfare. Sophie's lunch fork clattered onto her tray. "Mom," she whispered, "it's him." Diana nodded, equally stunned. They had assumed their brief encounter with the famous actor was a one-time occurrence, a lucky moment that would become a cherished family story. They never expected to see him again, particularly not here in the hospital where Sophie received her treatments. Ford approached the nurses' station first, speaking quietly with the staff, before turning to survey the room. His gaze landed on Sophie, and a warm smile of recognition spread across his face. He said something to Dr. Patel, then walked directly to Sophie's chair. "Hello again," he greeted her, his voice carrying the same gentle warmth it had at the lemonade stand. "I hope it's okay that I stopped by." Sophie nodded, momentarily speechless, a rare state for her normally articulate nature. "I brought something for you," Ford continued, gesturing to an assistant who stepped forward with several large bags. "Actually, for everyone here." From the bags emerged an assortment of Star Wars and Indiana Jones memorabilia, action figures, books, posters, and toys, many bearing Ford's signature. But these weren't just random promotional items. Each gift had been thoughtfully selected based on age appropriateness for the different children in the ward. "I called ahead to learn about the patients," Ford explained to Diana as his assistant distributed the gifts. "The hospital staff helped me choose things each child might enjoy." The careful consideration behind this gesture, the fact that Harrison Ford had taken time not just to visit, but to learn about each child's age and interests, moved Diana to tears. This was no publicity stunt or photo opportunity. No media had been invited, no cameras were present except parents' cell phones capturing their children's joy. For Sophie, Ford had brought a specially autographed copy of The Archaeology Handbook, a nod to both his Indiana Jones character and Sophie's expressed interest in science. Inside the cover, he had written, "To Sophie, a true explorer of courage and hope, your friend, Harrison Ford." "I remember you mentioned science at your lemonade stand," he told her as she traced the inscription with her finger. "I thought you might like this." "I love it," Sophie replied honestly, her initial awe giving way to genuine appreciation. "Thank you for remembering." Ford pulled up a chair beside Sophie's treatment recliner, settling in as if he had all the time in the world. "How are you feeling today?" he asked, his focus entirely on her, despite the excited whispers and stares from around the room. "Today's okay," Sophie answered candidly. "The medicine is making me a little sick, but Dr. Rivera says that means it's working." Ford nodded seriously. The hard treatments are often the most effective ones, whether it's medicine or life challenges. As they continued talking, Ford gradually included the other children in the room, moving from chair to chair, spending time with each patient. He showed Elijah how to make the Millennium Falcon toy fly with proper sound effects. He discussed music with teenage Zoe, finding common ground despite their generational gap. With little Miguel, he got down on the floor, joining his action figure game without hesitation. Parents watched in amazement as a Hollywood legend sat cross-legged on a hospital floor, making a 5-year-old giggle despite the chemicals flowing into his body. There was no pretense, no celebrity distance, just a genuine human connection with children fighting the hardest battle of their young lives. When Dr. Rivera entered the room to check on her patients, she found Harrison Ford engaged in an impromptu Star Wars trivia contest with several of the children, including Sophie, who had clearly been briefed on key plot points by her peers. "Mr. Ford," Dr. Rivera said, extending her hand, "I can't tell you what this means to our patients." Ford shook her hand warmly. "The honor is mine, Doctor. These kids are the real heroes in this room." Before leaving, Ford spent a few more minutes with Sophie, listening intently as she explained her treatment protocol and her hopes for newer, less toxic therapies for future pediatric cancer patients. "You know," he told her quietly as he prepared to depart, "that fund we discussed, for research, It's happening. My foundation is finalizing the details with the Children's Leukemia Research Foundation. We're establishing the Sophie Wilson Young Investigators Grant for innovative pediatric cancer treatments. Sophie's eyes widened. Named after me? Ford nodded, his expression serious. Your courage deserves recognition, and your advocacy for other kids needs to continue long after you've beaten this thing. As Harrison Ford said his goodbyes to the children and staff, promising to return for another visit, Sophie sat back in her treatment chair, clutching her autographed book. The nausea from her chemotherapy remained, but something had fundamentally shifted in her perspective. What had begun as a simple lemonade stand had somehow transformed into a movement that might help change the landscape of childhood cancer treatment. "Mom," she said softly as they watched Ford depart, "I think we're making a difference." Diana hugged her daughter carefully, mindful of the IV lines. "You made the difference, Sophie. You and your lemonade stand that Harrison Ford just happened to walk by." 2 weeks after Harrison Ford's hospital visit, Sophie sat in Dr. Rivera's office for her scheduled evaluation. These appointments always carried a weight of anxiety. They were the moments when progress was measured, treatment plans adjusted, and sometimes difficult news delivered. Mark and Diana flanked their daughter, each holding one of her hands as they waited for Dr. Rivera to return with Sophie's latest test results. The office walls were covered with children's artwork, colorful drawings from patients past and present. Sophie's own contribution, a watercolor painting of her lemonade stand, hung near the door. She focused on it now, drawing strength from the memory of that pivotal weekend when everything changed. When Dr. Rivera entered, her expression gave nothing away. The carefully neutral face of an oncologist who had delivered both miraculous recoveries and devastating setbacks throughout her career. "Sorry to keep you waiting," she said, settling behind her desk and opening Sophie's file. "I wanted to consult with Dr. Patel about these results." Diana's grip on Sophie's hand tightened involuntarily. Consultations with the head of pediatric oncology often signaled complications. "Is something wrong?" Mark asked, his voice steady despite the fear evident in his eyes. Dr. Rivera looked up from the file, and finally, her professional mask cracked into a smile. "Actually, something is very right. Sophie's latest bone marrow aspirate shows a significant reduction in leukemic cells. Her blood counts are improving across all parameters, and her molecular markers are trending in exactly the direction we want to see." The technical terms washed over the Wilsons, but the meaning was clear in Dr. Rivera's smile. Sophie was responding to treatment, responding well. "Does that mean the cancer is going away?" Sophie asked directly, always preferring straightforward answers to gentle evasions. "It means we're winning," Dr. Rivera replied honestly. "The cancer isn't gone yet, but it's retreating exactly as we hoped it would with this treatment protocol." Diana pressed a hand to her mouth, tears spilling despite her best efforts. Mark's shoulders sagged with relief, and Sophie sat a little straighter in her chair. "The targeted therapy we started last month seems to be particularly effective for Sophie," Dr. Rivera continued, turning her computer monitor so they could see the charts displaying Sophie's improving blood counts. "This is the treatment that wasn't fully covered by your insurance initially, the one we were able to implement thanks to the donation funds." The significance wasn't lost on any of them. Harrison Ford's generosity had not only relieved their financial burden, but had potentially accelerated Sophie's recovery by allowing access to the most advanced treatment options without delay or compromise. "When can I go back to school?" Sophie asked, always focused on returning to normalcy. Dr. Rivera smiled at the characteristic question. "Let's take it one step at a time. Your immune system is still compromised, though improving. Perhaps we can look at partial days in a few weeks, with proper precautions." As they discussed the details of continuing treatment and gradually reintroducing normal activities, Dr. Rivera's office phone rang. She excused herself to answer it, her expression shifting to surprise as she listened to the caller. "Yes, she's here with her parents now," she said, glancing at Sophie. "I'll ask them." Covering the receiver, she addressed the Wilsons. "That's Dr. Chen from the Children's Leukemia Research Foundation. He's calling about the Sophie Wilson Young Investigators Grant that Harrison Ford's foundation established. Apparently, there's been a significant development he'd like to discuss with all of you." Mark and Diana exchanged puzzled glances. Though they'd been involved in initial discussions about the grant, they hadn't expected further consultation on the Foundation's internal processes. "Please, put him on speaker," Diana requested. Dr. Rivera pressed a button on her phone. "Dr. Chen, you're on speaker with Sophie Wilson and her parents, as well as myself, Dr. Rivera." "Thank you," came a crisp, enthusiastic voice. "Sophie, Mr. and Mrs. Wilson, I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." "We were just reviewing Sophie's latest results," Dr. Rivera explained, "which are showing excellent improvement, by the way." "That's wonderful news," Dr. Chen responded warmly, "and actually quite relevant to why I'm calling. As you know, the Sophie Wilson Young Investigators Grant was established to fund innovative research in pediatric leukemia treatments. What you may not know is that we expedited the first grant to a team at Stanford that's been developing a targeted immunotherapy specifically for the genetic variant of ALL that Sophie has. ALL, acute lymphoblastic leukemia, was the precise form of cancer Sophie had been battling. The Wilsons listened intently as Dr. Chen continued. This team has been making remarkable progress but was facing a funding gap that threatened to slow their research. Thanks to the grant established in Sophie's name, they've been able to accelerate their clinical trials. The preliminary results are extremely promising, showing even better response rates and fewer side effects than current protocols. Dr. Rivera leaned forward, her professional interest evident. "Are you referring to the CD19-directed treatment that Dr. Nakamura's team has been developing?" "Exactly," Dr. Chen confirmed, "and they've requested something rather unusual. They would like to meet Sophie, the girl whose courage inspired the grant that's helping make their work possible. Would that be something you might consider?" Sophie, who had been listening quietly to the adults' conversation, suddenly sat up straighter. "They want to meet me? The scientists working on the medicine?" "They do," Dr. Chen replied. "They believe that connecting with the real children affected by this disease helps inform their work in meaningful ways. And frankly, your story has inspired many of them." Mark and Diana looked at their daughter, silently deferring the decision to her. Sophie had earned the right to determine how public her journey would be. "I'd like to meet them," Sophie decided after a moment's consideration. "Maybe I could learn more about how the medicine works. And maybe—" She hesitated, then continued with characteristic thoughtfulness. "Maybe meeting me will help them remember why their work matters on hard days." Dr. Chen's voice carried a smile. "That's exactly what they were hoping for, Sophie. Dr. Nakamura mentioned that putting a face to the research reminds his team what's really at stake." Arrangements were made for a video conference the following week, with the possibility of an in-person visit once Sophie was stronger. As the call ended, Dr. Rivera looked at her young patient with undisguised admiration. "You know," she said quietly, "in my 20 years treating pediatric cancer, I've never seen a patient your age make such an impact on research funding. What began as your lemonade stand has literally accelerated scientific progress." Sophie absorbed this information with the serious consideration she applied to all aspects of her disease. "So, other kids might get better medicine because of what happened with Mr. Ford?" "Not might," Dr. Rivera corrected gently. "They will. The research team has already reported breakthroughs that could help children with your specific form of leukemia within the year, rather than the 3 to 5 years originally projected." On the drive home, Sophie was unusually quiet, gazing out the window as suburban landscapes passed by. Diana watched her in the rearview mirror, recognizing the expression of deep thought her daughter often wore when processing complex information. "Everything okay back there, Soph?" Mark asked, noticing the same contemplative silence. Sophie turned from the window. "I was just thinking, I started the lemonade stand to help with our bills. I never thought it would help other kids get medicine that isn't even invented yet." The profound simplicity of her observation hung in the car, the recognition that a small act born of necessity had rippled outward in ways no one could have predicted. "That's how change often happens," Diana reflected. "One person takes a step because they must, and suddenly a path appears where none existed before." As they pulled into their driveway, Sophie noticed an unmarked package on their front porch. Inside, they found a model of the Millennium Falcon with a simple note. For my favorite co-pilot on her journey to the stars, keep flying, HF. Holding the model ship carefully in her hands, Sophie smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes and illuminated her face with the childhood joy that cancer had too often dimmed. "Mom," she said thoughtfully, "when I'm better, can we keep the lemonade stand going? Not for our bills anymore, but for the research foundation." Diana hugged her daughter close, breathing in the familiar scent of her, treasuring the growing strength in the small body that had endured so much. "I think that's a wonderful idea, sweetheart. Harrison Ford may have walked by your stand once, but the real miracle is what you started yourself, and what you'll continue to do." Above them, the sky stretched clear and blue, a horizon expanding with possibilities that hadn't existed just weeks before. Sophie's battle wasn't over, but for the first time since her diagnosis, the path forward seemed illuminated with genuine hope, visible not just to the Wilsons, but to countless other families, fighting the same enemy across examination rooms, hospital wards, and research laboratories throughout the country. 3 months after Harrison Ford's unexpected visit to Sophie's lemonade stand, the Wilson family gathered in their living room with Jessica Lynn from the Maple Ridge Gazette. What had begun as local coverage of a child's fundraising effort had evolved into a continuing relationship, with Jessica documenting Sophie's journey in a series of thoughtful articles that balanced public interest with the family's privacy. "So it's official?" Jessica asked, glancing up from her notebook. "The foundation is fully established?" Mark nodded, passing her a glossy brochure bearing the logo Sophie's Hope Foundation above an image of a lemonade stand silhouetted against a rising sun. The paperwork was finalized last week. Harrison Ford's legal team handled everything, making sure it was structured properly for long-term sustainability. The foundation represented an evolution far beyond anything the Wilsons had imagined when Sophie first proposed her lemonade stand. What began as a child's effort to help with family medical bills had transformed into a national organization dedicated to 2 primary missions: direct financial assistance for families facing pediatric cancer and funding for advanced research into less toxic treatments. "Mr. Ford didn't just give us money," Sophie explained, sitting cross-legged on the couch. Her hair had begun growing back in soft tufts, a physical manifestation of her improving health. "He connected us with people who know how to make real change happen." Indeed, the actor had leveraged his considerable influence to bring together medical professionals, philanthropists, and business leaders who could transform a momentary viral story into lasting infrastructure for helping other families. The initial board of directors included Dr. Rivera, 2 childhood cancer survivors now in their 30s, a healthcare policy expert, and a financial advisor specializing in nonprofit management. "The most important part," Diana added, "is that families can access emergency funds within 48 hours of application. When your child is diagnosed with cancer, financial help that arrives months later isn't nearly as meaningful as immediate assistance with mortgage payments, utility bills, or transportation costs." This insight came from the Wilsons' own experience. The knowledge that cancer's financial toxicity often struck hardest in those first overwhelming weeks when parents were simultaneously processing their child's diagnosis and navigating complex medical systems. "I understand Harrison Ford has committed to ongoing support," Jessica prompted, her journalistic instincts sensing there was more to the story. Mark nodded. "He's pledged $1 million annually for the next 5 years, but he's been clear that he doesn't want the foundation to rely solely on his contributions long-term. He's helping us build relationships with corporate sponsors and develop sustainable fundraising strategies." "Like the National Lemonade Stand Day," Sophie interjected excitedly. "Kids all over the country will run lemonade stands on the same Saturday in June, with proceeds going to the foundation. We're sending special kits with signs and t-shirts to everyone who registers." Jessica smiled, jotting notes. "That's a wonderful way to keep the original spirit of your idea alive, Sophie. How many participants are you expecting?" "Over 3,000 stands have registered so far," Diana replied, still sounding somewhat amazed by the figure. "Schools, scout troops, sports teams, neighborhoods. The response has been overwhelming." What went unmentioned was how Harrison Ford had quietly enlisted several of his celebrity friends to make appearances at select lemonade stands across the country on the designated day, ensuring media coverage that would amplify the foundation's reach. The actor himself had committed to visiting Sophie's stand, which would once again be set up in Maple Ridge's town square, returning to where it all began. "And the research initiative?" Jessica asked, turning to a new page in her notebook. Sophie straightened, pride evident in her expression. The Sophie Wilson Young Investigators Grant has already funded 3 research teams, she explained, with the detailed understanding she had developed through regular video conferences with the scientists. One team is working on targeted therapy that attacks cancer cells without hurting healthy cells as much. Another is studying why some kids relapse after treatment. And the third is developing better ways to help survivors with long-term side effects. Jessica couldn't help but be impressed by the 10-year-old's grasp of complex medical concepts, another consequence of her journey through illness. "That's remarkable, Sophie. Do you still keep in touch with Dr. Nakamura's team?" Sophie nodded enthusiastically. "They send me updates every month with pictures from their lab. And guess what? Their new treatment got approved for expanded clinical trials last week. Kids at 20 hospitals will be able to receive it now." The mention of treatment naturally led to the question Jessica had been hesitant to ask. "And how is your own treatment progressing, Sophie? If you're comfortable sharing that." Sophie exchanged a glance with her parents, who nodded encouragingly. "Dr. Rivera says I'm in what they call molecular remission," she answered, pronouncing the technical term carefully. "That means they can't find cancer cells in my bone marrow anymore, even with their strongest microscopes. I still have 7 more months of maintenance therapy to make sure it doesn't come back, but—" She paused, a smile spreading across her face. "I get to go back to school full-time next month." This milestone, the return to normal childhood activities, represented a triumph that transcended all the Foundation's achievements. For the Wilson family, no amount of fundraising success or national recognition could compare to the simple joy of watching Sophie reclaim pieces of her interrupted childhood. "That's wonderful news," Jessica said warmly, before turning to a topic she knew would interest her readers. "I understand Harrison Ford continues to be personally involved with your family?" Diana smiled. "He calls Sophie every other week just to check in. No publicity, no cameras, just a genuine connection. He sent books when she was too tired for visitors and a telescope when she mentioned an interest in astronomy during one of their calls. He's teaching me about constellations," Sophie added. "He says looking at stars helps you remember that your problems are tiny compared to the whole universe." This glimpse into the continuing relationship between the famous actor and the child whose courage had moved him revealed something that hadn't been captured in viral videos or news reports, the authentic human connection that had formed beyond the initial headline-making moment. "The Foundation is preparing a special announcement," Mark mentioned, changing the subject slightly. "We're establishing a navigation program to help families coordinate between medical teams, insurance companies, and support services. Many parents are too overwhelmed to effectively advocate for their children in those early days after diagnosis." This initiative reflected another lesson from the Wilsons' experience, the recognition that financial assistance, while crucial, addressed only one aspect of cancer's impact on families. The complex healthcare system often became an additional burden for parents already struggling with their child's illness. "We're hiring social workers with oncology experience to serve as dedicated navigators," Diana explained. "They'll help families understand treatment options, appeal insurance denials, apply for assistance programs, and coordinate care between specialists, essentially providing the support Mark and I wished we'd had during those first terrifying weeks." As Jessica prepared to leave, promising to share her article draft with the family before publication, Sophie walked her to the door. The reporter noticed that the girl moved with more energy than she had displayed in previous visits, her steps steadier, her complexion healthier. "Before you go," Sophie said, suddenly serious, "I want you to know something important. Even though the Foundation has my name on it, it's not really about me. It's about all the kids fighting cancer who don't get famous actors visiting their lemonade stands." Jessica nodded, recognizing the wisdom in Sophie's perspective. "That's an important distinction. Is there anything specific you'd like me to emphasize in the article?" Sophie considered the question with characteristic thoughtfulness. "Could you tell people that helping one family is good, but changing the system would be better? So no family has to sell lemonade to pay for their child's medicine." In that moment, Jessica was reminded that behind the heartwarming story that had captivated the nation, stood a remarkably perceptive child who understood that her experience, while transformed by celebrity intervention, remained the exception rather than the rule. While Sophie had found her happy ending, thousands of other families continued to face both the medical and financial devastation of pediatric cancer without viral stories or famous benefactors. "I'll make sure that message comes through clearly," Jessica promised. "Some stories fade from public attention, but I think yours has the potential to create lasting change." As the reporter drove away from the Wilson home, she reflected on how a simple childhood enterprise, a lemonade stand born of necessity, had evolved into something with the potential to transform pediatric cancer care across the nation, all because Harrison Ford happened to walk by at exactly the right moment. 1 year to the day after Sophie first set up her lemonade stand, the town square of Maple Ridge was transformed. Gone was the modest card table with its hand-painted sign. In its place stood an elaborate installation of a dozen lemonade stands, each staffed by children in bright yellow Sophie's Hope t-shirts. Some of these children were cancer patients themselves, others were survivors, and many were simply supporters who had been moved by Sophie's story. The anniversary celebration had been carefully planned for months, timed to coincide with Sophie's final treatment, the ceremonial end to her cancer journey. Earlier that morning, Sophie had sat in Dr. Rivera's office for her last chemotherapy infusion, surrounded by family, medical staff who had become like extended family, and one very special guest who had flown in specifically for the occasion. "How does it feel to be done?" Harrison Ford had asked her as the nurse removed the IV for the final time, his voice low and warm as he sat beside Sophie's treatment chair. Sophie had considered the question seriously, as was her nature. "Scary but good," she'd finally answered. "Dr. Rivera says I'll still need checkups, but..." She'd smiled then, a radiant expression that illuminated her entire face. "I get to just be a kid again." Now, as the midday sun shone down on Maple Ridge Town Square, Sophie stood on a small platform addressing the gathered crowd. Her hair had grown back in soft chestnut waves, slightly darker than before her treatment. She'd gained weight, her face filling out to once again resemble the round-cheeked girl in pre-diagnosis photographs. Most striking was her energy, the vibrant presence that cancer had temporarily dimmed, now fully rekindled. "When I started my lemonade stand, I just wanted to help my parents with medical bills," Sophie told the assembled crowd, her voice clear and confident through the microphone. "I never imagined what would happen next. I never thought I'd meet Harrison Ford, or that we'd create a foundation, or that kids all across the country would be running their own lemonade stands today." Behind her, a large screen displayed live video feeds from some of the 3,000 lemonade stands operating simultaneously across all 50 states, the national day of fundraising that had grown from Sophie's initial idea. In New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, and dozens of other cities, children were selling lemonade to benefit the Sophie's Hope Foundation, many accompanied by local celebrities who had answered Harrison Ford's call to support the cause. "The best part isn't the money we've raised, though that's important," Sophie continued. "The best part is that nobody facing childhood cancer has to feel alone anymore. When my family was scared about bills, we felt like we were the only ones with that problem. Now we know that lots of families struggle with the same things, and we're all working together to help each other." In the front row, Mark and Diana watched their daughter with a mixture of pride and amazement. The past year had transformed Sophie in ways that transcended her physical recovery. The shy, bookish child had become a poised young advocate, confident in speaking to crowds or meeting with hospital administrators and research scientists. Yet she remained fundamentally herself, thoughtful, kind, and more interested in helping others than in claiming spotlight for herself. Harrison Ford stood to the side of the stage, deliberately avoiding center position. From the beginning, he had insisted that Sophie remain the face of the foundation, with his own involvement serving to amplify rather than overshadow her message. Today, dressed in a simple blue Sophie's Hope polo shirt and khakis, he looked more like a supportive uncle than a Hollywood icon. "I want to introduce someone special," Sophie said, winding down her speech. "Most of you know Harrison Ford as a famous actor who changed my life with his generosity, but I know him as the person who calls me every week to talk about stars and books and science, who remembers the names of all my doctors, and who taught me that fame is only worth something if you use it to help others." Ford shook his head slightly, characteristically uncomfortable with praise, but he stepped forward when Sophie gestured for him to join her. The crowd's applause swelled, phones raised to capture the moment when the movie star placed a supportive hand on the shoulder of the young girl who had so deeply affected him. "Sophie asked me to say a few words," Ford began, his voice carrying that familiar gravelly warmth recognized by millions of moviegoers. "But this isn't about me. It's about what happens when ordinary courage meets extraordinary circumstances." He paused, looking down at Sophie with genuine affection before continuing. "1 year ago, I walked past a lemonade stand and met a young lady who wasn't asking for pity. She was taking action, facing challenges most adults would find overwhelming, with a determination that stopped me in my tracks. The foundation that bears her name has since raised over $12 million, funded 6 promising research initiatives, and provided direct financial assistance to more than 800 families facing childhood cancer." These statistics drew appreciative murmurs from the crowd, many of whom were only now realizing the full scope of what had grown from their local human interest story. "But the numbers don't tell the real story," Ford continued. "The real story is about a system that forces families to choose between financial ruin and their child's health. It's about parents skipping meals to pay for medications, missing mortgage payments to cover hospital parking fees, and children feeling guilty for the financial burden their illness creates." His voice took on an edge of controlled intensity that Sophie recognized from their many conversations about healthcare policy. Sophie's courage deserves celebration, but her circumstances demand change. No family should need a chance encounter with someone like me to secure their child's treatment. That's why the Sophie's Hope Foundation isn't just providing Band-Aid solutions. We're advocating for fundamental reform in how we approach pediatric illness in this country. The crowd had grown quiet, the festive atmosphere temporarily yielding to the seriousness of Ford's message. Then Sophie stepped forward again, naturally reclaiming her role as the day's central figure. "Today isn't just about celebrating my last treatment," she said, her voice brightening the mood once more. "It's about celebrating everyone who has joined our lemonade revolution. My friend Maya, who helped design our first sign, Ms. Jessica, who told our story, Dr. Rivera, who never gave up on me, and every single person who bought lemonade or shared our posts or started their own fundraisers." On cue, dozens of yellow balloons were released behind the stage, each bearing the name of a child currently undergoing cancer treatment. Sophie had insisted that the celebration acknowledge those still fighting their battles. "Now," she announced with a grin, "Mr. Ford and I are going to serve lemonade together at the same stand where we first met. And yes, we use real lemons, no powder mix." The formalities concluded, Sophie and Harrison Ford took their positions behind the central lemonade stand, a beautifully constructed replica of Sophie's original card table setup. As people lined up to purchase commemorative cups filled with Sophie's grandmother's recipe, Ford leaned down to speak privately to Sophie. "How are you holding up?" "Not too tired?" Sophie shook her head, her eyes bright with excitement. "This is the best day ever. Did you see how many people came?" Ford smiled, that famous crooked grin that had charmed moviegoers for decades. "They didn't come for me, you know. They came for you, their hometown hero." As Sophie handed out cups of lemonade, accepting donations and thanking each person individually, Diana watched from nearby, marveling at her daughter's stamina and spirit. The fear that had been her constant companion for over a year, the terror of losing her child, had finally begun to recede, replaced by cautious optimism and profound gratitude. Mark slipped his arm around his wife's shoulders. "She did it," he said simply. "All of it. The treatment, the foundation, bringing an entire community together." Diana nodded, unable to speak past the emotion tightening her throat. Their daughter had faced death and emerged not just alive, but somehow larger, her spirit expanded by the very challenges that might have crushed it. And in the process, she had created something that would continue helping other families long after her own battle was won. As the sun began to set on Maple Ridge Town Square, the anniversary celebration of Sophie's Hope continued, a testament to how the simple courage of a child selling lemonade could, with the right catalyst, create ripples of change that extended far beyond one family or one small town, all because Harrison Ford had chosen to walk by at precisely the right moment. 18 months after Sophie's final treatment, on a crisp autumn evening, the grand ballroom of the Westfield Hotel in Chicago was filled to capacity. The inaugural Sophie's Hope Foundation Gala had drawn attendees from across the nation: medical researchers, corporate sponsors, celebrity supporters, and most importantly, families whose lives had been touched by childhood cancer. At a small table near the stage sat Sophie Wilson, now 12 years old and cancer-free for over a year. Her hair had grown into a stylish bob, and she wore a yellow dress chosen specifically for the foundation's signature color. Beside her sat her parents, Mark and Diana, both finally showing signs of having recovered from the emotional and physical toll of their daughter's illness. Maya, Sophie's loyal best friend, who had stood by her throughout the darkest days, completed their table. "Nervous?" Mark asked, noticing Sophie fidgeting with her note cards. She nodded, offering a small smile. "A little. It's a lot bigger than talking at the lemonade stand." Indeed, addressing 500 people at a black tie fundraiser was considerably different from chatting with customers in the town square. Yet, over the past year, Sophie had gradually grown into her role as the foundation's young ambassador, speaking at hospitals, schools, and community events with increasing confidence. "Just be yourself," Diana advised, squeezing her daughter's hand. "That's who everyone came to see." On the stage, Dr. Rivera, now the medical director of the Sophie's Hope Foundation, approached the microphone. "Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our first annual gala celebrating the remarkable work of the Sophie's Hope Foundation. In just 18 months, this organization has grown from a single lemonade stand to a national force in pediatric cancer support and research." Dr. Rivera proceeded to outline the foundation's achievements: direct financial assistance to over 2,000 families, funding for 12 promising research initiatives, the establishment of family navigation programs at 22 hospitals, and successful advocacy for expanded insurance coverage of experimental treatments for childhood cancers. "But statistics don't capture the human impact," she continued. "For that, I want to introduce the young woman whose courage inspired it all. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Sophie Wilson." The ballroom erupted in applause as Sophie made her way to the stage, walking with the measured steps of someone determined not to trip in front of an audience. As she reached the podium, adjustable for her height, she caught sight of Harrison Ford seated at a front table, giving her an encouraging nod. "Hi, everyone," Sophie began, her voice clear despite her nerves. "Thank you for coming tonight. A lot of people call me brave for fighting cancer, but I don't think surviving an illness makes you brave. I think what you choose to do with that experience is what matters." She paused, gathering her thoughts before continuing. "When I was sick, the hardest part wasn't the chemotherapy, or losing my hair, or feeling nauseous all the time. The hardest part was seeing my parents worried about money when they should have been focused only on helping me get better." From his table, Harrison Ford watched the young speaker with quiet pride. Their weekly phone calls had continued long after Sophie entered remission, evolving into a genuine friendship that transcended their unusual beginning. He had deliberately avoided taking center stage at the gala, insisting that Sophie and other pediatric cancer families remain the evening's focus. "No family should have to choose between paying their mortgage and giving their child the best possible cancer treatment," Sophie continued, her voice growing stronger. "No parent should have to start a GoFundMe just to afford hospital parking while their child receives chemotherapy. And no child should ever feel like a financial burden because they got sick through no fault of their own." The ballroom had fallen completely silent, hundreds of elegantly dressed attendees captivated by the wisdom emanating from the 12-year-old at the podium. "Over the past year, I've met hundreds of kids with cancer and their families. Some of them are here tonight." Sophie gestured to several tables where children in various stages of treatment sat with their parents. "Every single one of these families has shown incredible courage, not just in fighting the disease, but in navigating a healthcare system that sometimes feels designed to defeat them." Sophie then introduced several foundation initiatives, including a groundbreaking partnership with 5 major pharmaceutical companies to reduce the cost of pediatric cancer medications, a college scholarship program for childhood cancer survivors, and a new research grant focused specifically on reducing the long-term side effects of treatment. "And tonight," she announced, "I'm excited to share that the Sophie's Hope Navigation Program will expand to 50 additional hospitals next year, ensuring that no family faces cancer alone. These navigators help families understand their insurance, find financial assistance, coordinate appointments, and basically serve as professional problem solvers during the most difficult time in a family's life. More applause followed this announcement, particularly from medical professionals who understood the critical importance of such support services. Before I finish, I want to acknowledge someone who changed everything for my family and for thousands of others. Sophie turned toward Harrison Ford's table. Mr. Ford doesn't like being the center of attention, and he always says this foundation isn't about him. He's right. It's about all the kids fighting cancer who don't happen to have a famous actor walk by their lemonade stand. Ford smiled slightly, acknowledging her words with a small nod. But the truth is, Sophie continued, sometimes it takes someone with a powerful voice to help others be heard. Mr. Ford didn't just write a check and walk away. He helped create something sustainable that will help families long after my cancer story is old news. And he taught me that having influence means using it for people who don't have any. Sophie's words drew appreciative murmurs throughout the ballroom. Harrison Ford's ongoing commitment to the foundation, largely conducted away from public view, had earned him profound respect among those who worked closely with the organization. I don't know why Mr. Ford decided to stop at my lemonade stand that day, Sophie reflected, her tone thoughtful. Maybe it was just chance, or maybe it was something more. But I do know that each of us has opportunities every day to stop and notice someone who needs help, to use whatever resources or connections we have to make a difference. She looked out at the assembled guests, her expression earnest. You don't need to be a movie star to change someone's life. You just need to be willing to see people who are hurting and do something about it, even if it's small, because sometimes the smallest actions, like buying a cup of lemonade from a bald girl, can start something amazing. As Sophie concluded her speech to thunderous applause, Diana wiped tears from her eyes, overwhelmed by her daughter's poise and wisdom. Mark sat beside her, his expression a mixture of pride and wonder at the remarkable young woman their child had become. When Sophie returned to their table, Harrison Ford rose to greet her, embracing her with the easy affection of genuine friendship rather than celebrity condescension. Not bad for a lemonade vendor, he teased gently. Sophie grinned. I had a good teacher. You give pretty great speeches in your movies. Later that evening, as the foundation's first gala concluded with the announcement that over $4 million had been raised, Sophie stood near the ballroom's entrance, thanking guests as they departed. Many of them, researchers, healthcare providers, corporate executives, spoke to her not as a child, but as a respected colleague in the fight against pediatric cancer. Dr. Nakamura, whose research team had been the first recipients of the Sophie Wilson Young Investigators Grant, stopped to share exciting news. Our therapy has been approved by the FDA, he told her, beaming with professional satisfaction. Starting next month, it will be available at every major children's hospital in the country. The data shows an 82% response rate with significantly reduced toxicity compared to standard protocols. Sophie understood exactly what this meant. Hundreds of children would be spared the worst side effects she had experienced. Their quality of life during treatment dramatically improved. That's the best news ever, she replied, her face lighting up. Better than all the fundraising combined. As the evening wound down, the Wilson family and Harrison Ford found themselves alone in the emptying ballroom. They had come a long way from that chance encounter at a humble lemonade stand in Maple Ridge. What's next? Ford asked Sophie, genuinely curious about her vision for the foundation's future. Sophie considered the question seriously. I think we need to focus more on helping survivors, she said finally. Cancer doesn't end when treatment does. A lot of kids have learning problems from chemotherapy, or heart damage, or fertility issues. We need better support systems for the after part of cancer. Ford nodded thoughtfully. Good thinking. I'll have my team look into existing programs we might partner with. As they prepared to leave, Sophie paused, looking up at the actor who had become an unexpected constant in her life. Thank you, she said simply. Not just for the money or the foundation or anything like that. Thank you for seeing me, not just as a sick kid, but as a person with something to offer. Ford's expression softened, the practiced reserve of a longtime celebrity giving way to genuine emotion. "Sophie Wilson," he said quietly, "you are, without question, one of the most remarkable individuals I've ever met, at any age. It has been my privilege to know you." As they walked out of the ballroom together, the movie star, the cancer survivor, and her family, they represented something powerful, a reminder that extraordinary change can begin with the simplest of encounters, that courage comes in many forms, and that sometimes the most meaningful connections are forged in the most unexpected moments. The lemonade stand that started it all was now preserved in the foundation's headquarters, a humble symbol of how a child's determination, a community's support, and one famous man's compassion had combined to create a legacy that would continue changing lives long after Sophie Wilson had grown up and moved beyond her identity as the lemonade girl who met Harrison Ford. For Sophie herself, cancer would always be part of her story, but now it was just a chapter, not the whole book. Ahead lay school, friendships, dreams, and the ordinary challenges of growing up, all approached with the extraordinary perspective of someone who had faced mortality and emerged determined to make every moment matter, not just for herself, but for all the children who would follow in her footsteps along the difficult journey through pediatric cancer.